Hey guys, this is Dorian Day and welcome to Massive In-Depth number 12. Today we're going to be talking about Massive's AMP and FX section. This section comprises the box in the upper right portion of Massive's interface. From top left to right, we have the AMP mod where you determine the main amplitude control for the synth. By default, this is envelope 4. We also have the master pan control. Next we have the bypass slider, which controls the amount the bypass signal leaks past the filters. There's more info on this in Massive In-Depth number 2, where we talk about the routing page. Finally, in this row, we have the master volume, which allows you to balance the final output of Massive. Below, we have the row of FX units and equalizer. You can turn them on like the rest of Massive's units by clicking this circle. You can change the selected effect by clicking the drop-down menu. There are 17 choices for the first unit and 14 for the second. They're all the same up until the amps, which only occur in the first effects unit. So let's go through the effects. The first two things you have are reverbs. You have small and just regular. They are the same algorithm with the internal parameters mapped to different ranges for a large versus small effect. The dry wet knob controls the amount of wet signal. Size basically controls the time of the reverb until you can't hear it anymore. Density controls the diffusion of the reverb, basically how thick it is. Lower density has more echoes, makes it sound thicker. Then the color is a filter. Sorry, I wasn't on the right thing. Then color is a filter. It changes the balance of the frequencies. So let's see. I don't recall if it's brighter, right or left. So it's brighter. Well, actually, yeah, I guess I had it written down from the manual. Left is duller, right is brighter. Next, we have the flanging effects. So in a flanger, the signal is slightly delayed while the delayed time is LFO'd, and then the resulting signal is mixed with the original. There are mono and stereo versions of both the positive and negative versions. The positive version adds the signal back to the original signal, while the negative version subtracts it. Dry wet works the same as on the reverb. Rate controls the speed of the pitch change on the flange, and I can play this so you can try and maybe kind of hear what's going on. So this is on full wet. Now, since this is full wet, this is basically a copy of the original sound, but its speed is being slowed down and sped up so that it sounds like its pitch is changing. Well, I suppose its pitch actually is changing, but it's sort of an illusion. And then you mix it back with the original. And then feedback adds some of the original sound back in. So it takes the output, puts it back in over and over again. And that intensifies the sound. Finally, you have the depth amount, which increases the amount of time delay. So if we go back to no feedback, rate. It's basically how far off time or pitch the delayed line goes. So with a high depth and a lot of feedback, you get really like metallic sounds. All right, next we have chorus. Chorus creates a chorus effect. The signal sounds as if it was created by a choir. Kind of. I mean, it works really good on pads and chords and stuff. Super saws. So it's I don't know if I already said this, but it's created by taking multiple voices and pitching them slightly differently. So it's sort of like a voice detune. This effect is technically achieved by delaying the signal and constantly modulating the delay time. There are 3 versions: normal, mono, and ensemble, which has 4 delay lines. Rate controls the rate of modulation, so like how fast the voices are moving. Offset controls the initial delay from the original signal. And depth controls the amount of delay time modulation. Next we have the phasers. The phasers create a classic phasing sound, as with analog gear like the classic small stone phaser. Technically speaking, this effect is created by routing the signal through several all-pass filters with modulated frequencies that change the phase of the signal, depending on the signal and the filter's frequency. When this change signal is mixed with the original signal, phase changes create sonically interesting interference patterns. The controls for the phaser include rate, the speed of the all-pass frequency modulation, and depth, the all-pass frequency modulation amount, and feedback. The amount of feedback increases intensity. So we have all-pass filters in the filter section, and pretty much what this does is it perfectly cancels out some frequency in the frequency spectrum. And in a phaser, you have like 8 of these. It's the number of stages you have, and you set them. I think typically they're set at set intervals, or maybe they move depending on the frequency range. I'm not sure. It's up to the manufacturer, and I don't know a lot about phaser design, but you have these all-pass filters, and they comb through the frequency range and cancel out sounds, and then when you remix it with the original signal, you get phasing sounds, especially when you change the frequency of the filter. But it also does cool resonance effects when you just have when you don't have the LFO on. So that's like why they added it here as a filter type. But it's also cool to use phasers that have like a lot of stages, like 8 up to 48, that don't have LFOs on them, that let you just set the frequency you want to use them. Like the Ubic series, they let you put the modulators, like they have flanger and granulator and a phaser. They let you put them in manual mode where the LFO doesn't move, and you just get the like comb filtered sound, which is cool. So next we have 2 delays. The first is a simple delay. It just repeats the sound once. You have dry, wet. Dampening controls the amount of highs on the delayed signal, and then you have time left and right, so you can change the channel delay independently, and I think it's probably in milliseconds. Then you have delay synced, dry wet knob again, dampening for the high ends inside the delay chain, and then you have feedback to control the amount of feedback. And left and right delay controls. The bottom number is like your time signature. If you have 1, you're in whole notes. If you're in 16, you're in 16 notes. I believe this is true. It might have something to do with your DAW settings also, but I think as long as you're at using 4/4 in your sequencer, then what I'm saying is true. And then the top note is how many of these you have. So if you have 3 and then 16, then you have 3 16th notes. Meaning that there are 3 16th notes wait or delay before the repetition actually happens. Next we have the dimension expander. The massive manual says this is a combination of delay and chorus. It creates very clear room-style spatial effects. Size controls the pre-delay and tail of the signal. You can see as you bring the size down, it sounds a little smaller, and the pre-delay is almost none. But as you go to the opposite end, there's pre-delay, and it sounds like it lasts a little bit longer. Next are the amp effects. So the first is the classic tube. It simulates the effect of running your put through a 2 amplifier to help you create a warmer or dirtier sound. The drive knob controls the amount of input amplification and thus the amount of distortion in the output signal. If you look at the classic tube on a sine wave in the spec analyzer, you'll see it adds both even and odd harmonics. So let me bring that up. So right now we just have the fundamental. If I increase dry wet, you see the harmonics come in. We have C and then C and then G and then C again. So these are the even and odd harmonics. If we go to Teletube, we have similar sound, except for it's not as bright. It's like a mellower version, but you have both even and odd harmonics. And finally, you have the Bronner tube, and this only introduces odd harmonics. It sounds, I mean, it's kind of hard to describe, but it sounds, I guess, a little more piercing and less rounded and warm. And that's what we sort of expect from odd harmonics, is to kind of be like the dirtier, more intense, less pleasant types of distortion versus the even harmonics. So like discussed earlier, you can put any of the first 14 effects in the second unit. And then finally, we have an EQ. It's a high shelf, low shelf, and then a frequency boost. I don't really like the boost too much. I don't use it very often, but I try sometimes. The high is good for creating really bright sounds that you're just gonna have to EQ out later, but it seems like it's important in getting what I would call the massive sound. Now that I've gotten better at massive, I guess this is a good time for reflection on sound design, because that's what we're going to start doing after this, because massive we're pretty much done explaining all its functionality. I opened Massive the first time like 4 years ago after getting into dance music, listening to like Deadmau5 and Skrillex and all the likes. And then at the time, I guess like some dubstep people were big, like Dr. P and Flex Pavilion. And anyone else who used Massive. I mean, the list goes on. And it always seemed like everything was just like so bright and intense, and I could never figure out what was going on. And part of the reason was I shied away from so many things inside of the synthesizer because of reading, particularly on Gearslut, where everyone has a really strong opinion about everything, which, duly so, I do too. But, and a lot of that is, the stuff inside of synthesizers, the effects inside of synthesizers are bad. You should just use the filters and the oscillators and do stuff outside of it, because you can buy better plugins or whatnot. But the issue with that is perhaps that's true, but if you're trying to emulate the sound of a particular artist, like if you're trying to make one of, I don't remember, I guess is it Flux Pavilion that did Cracks? If you're trying to recreate that bright lead, you probably need to use the high shelf in filter or in Massive. I mean, I'm not 100% sure that's a massive lead, but I mean, I would bet money on it that it is. And they crank up the clipping, and it's not just any clipping, it's Massive's clipping, and it has a particular sound, and they crank up the EQ, and it's not just any EQ, it's Massive's EQ. And a lot of, there's even arguments that digital EQs are all the same, but there's something about what's going on that makes this sound, I think, massive-y is the best way to put it. It has a sound, and if you're trying to achieve that sound, you should use as many of the things inside of Massive as possible, and then figure out afterwards how you're going to make it sit in your mix or be unique or be modern or be your own. Like I made a bunch of 8-bit patches, and I cranked up the high shelf on a lot of them, and then I went to make the demo, and they were pretty much unmixable in terms of like just to be on their own. You had to EQ out the highs. And when I EQ'd out the highs, they sounded great. They still sounded awesome. And that's kind of the point of both sound design and mixing. It's like you make this cool sound. I mean, it has to fit within the arrangement of what's going on, and then you mix it. You try and cut stuff out and make it fit with whatever's left. Granted, I was making 8-bit leads so there was an increased emphasis on like high shelf boosting and emulating aliasing and distortion, blah 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 blah. So it depends on what kind of sound you're going for, but I found I've gotten a lot more out of Massive the more I try and add the sounds from within the synth itself and try and get the uniqueness there before moving outside of the synthesizer. All right, well, this completes Massive in depth number 12 and completes this section on Massive's functionality. From here out, we're going to start doing sound design. Thanks for watching.